So what we did is that we helped fuel China's phenomenal growth between 1990 and 2017 when it became a great power.
大家知道现在美国战略界最后悔的一件事是什么吗？不是打输了阿富汗战争，也不是搞砸了中东局势，而是他们在过去30年里做了一个灾难性的决定，亲手把中国喂成了一个超级大国。说这话的不是别人，正是美国进攻性现实主义的泰斗米尔斯海默。他在最新的访谈里，不仅痛批美国的接触政策是愚蠢的，还无奈地承认，现在的中国已经是美国无法撼动的对手。更让人意外的是，当谈到台海局势时，这位著名的鹰派竟然说出了那句充满东方智慧的话：中国真的很擅长等待。美国为什么会后悔？中国到底在等待什么？别眨眼，阿星带你听听这位美国顶级智囊米尔斯海默的忏悔录。
But in, attempting to show strength, we reveal weakness. I mean, that's my concern is, once you project force and it doesn't work, then you're revealed to the world as weak. The limits of your power are obvious to everybody. It's better to threaten and have, your true power concealed. People can guess it, what you can do. But now there's no guessing. We couldn't be Russia. And
that's correct.
Right.
That's
so
correct.
We lost a war to Russia. It's a proxy war, but it was a war. And so what does that mean?
Well, it is, a devastating defeat for NATO.
Yeah.
Because we have invested so much in this war, right? The other problem that we face is that the United States, and this is true of both the Biden and Trump administration, consider China to be the principal threat to the United States. China is a peer competitor. Russia is not a peer competitor. Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. Russia is not the Soviet Union. China is a peer competitor. It's a threat to dominate Asia. And what we've been trying to do since 2011, when Hillary Clinton announced it, when she was Secretary of State, is we've been trying to pivot to Asia. But what's happened here is we've got bogged down in Ukraine, and now we're bogged down in the Middle East. And this makes it difficult to fully pivot to Asia. And this is not in the American national interest. But to make matters even worse, what we have done is we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese.
Yes.
If you think about it, we live in a world where there are three great powers: the United States, China, and Russia. If the United States views China as its principal competitor, and the United States is interested in containing China in East Asia, it would make eminently good sense to have Russia on its side of the equation.
Course.
Instead, what we've done with the Ukraine war is we've driven the Russians and the Russians and the Chinese closer together.
So that's so obvious, even to me, a non-specialist, just like, it's obvious, just look at a map, that it had to have been obvious to the previous administration, but they did it anyway. So you have to kind of wonder, did they want that?
I think you're underestimating how much strategic sense the American foreign policy establishment has.
So they're just so incompetent they didn't see that coming?
Yes. I mean, I'll take it a step further.
I mean, come on.
Let's talk about China. This is an even bigger issue. The Cold War ends, and as you well remember, at the end of the Cold War, China and the United States were basically allied together against the Soviet Union.
Of course, that was the whole point. Yeah.
Right. So the Soviet Union, Cold War ends, Soviet Union disappears. And there's no longer any need for us to have a close relationship with China. We don't need them to help contain the Soviet Union. So the question is, what do we do with the Chinese moving forward? And economically, China is a backwards country in the early 1990s. What we do is we adopt a policy of engagement with China. Engagement is explicitly designed to turn China into a very wealthy country. This is a country that has over 4 times the population of the United States. And you're talking about making it very rich. For a realist like me, this is lunacy. You are, in effect, creating a peer competitor. In fact, you may be creating a country that is more powerful than the United States. But the foreign policy establishment in the United States, almost to a person, including hawks like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, said that China can grow economically. We can integrate it into institutions like the World Trade Organization and so forth and so on. And it will become a democracy, and we will all live happily ever after, right? So what we did is that we helped fuel China's phenomenal growth between 1990 and 2017 when it became a great power. You want to remember that when the Cold War ends and then the Soviet Union collapses in December of 1991, we enter the unipolar moment, which by definition means there's one great power on the planet.
Yeah.
That's the United States of America. By 2017, there are three great powers on the planet. And one of those three great powers is a peer competitor. And we helped create that peer competitor on the foolish belief that if we turned China into a rich country, it would become a liberal democracy and it would become a friend of the United States and it would allow us to run international politics the way we did during unipolarity. This is a remarkably catastrophic decision.
It must be strange for you, having spent your life in this one field, both in the military effectively and then in academia, and you've had tenure at Chicago since 82. Is that right?
Well, I went to Chicago in 82. I got tenure in 1987.
So you've been there over 40 years working on this suite of topics, this group of topics. When you look around and everybody, even the most famous people in your field, are buying into something that's stupid, how does that make you feel? Brzezinski and Kissinger are saying things that are just like obviously dumb. That must be weird.
It was very weird. I remember I debated Zbig in the early 2000s at Carnegie in Washington, D.C. On whether China could rise peacefully. And there's actually a big story in Foreign Policy, the magazine, that has an abbreviated transcript of our debate. And I remember Zbig was arguing that China can rise peacefully, and I was arguing that China could not rise peacefully and that our policy of engagement was foolish. And as he was speaking and I was sitting on the dais, I was saying to myself, I don't get what's going on here. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's about 10 notches to the right of me on almost all foreign policy issues, shouldn't be making this argument, but he's making this argument.
Yes.
And I'm the one who looks like a super hawk. When at the end of the Cold War, I was more on the dovish side, arguing the Soviets were not 10 feet tall. And of course, Big was always arguing the Soviets were 10 feet tall. So it was really perplexing. And throughout the 90s and throughout the early 2000s, when I argued China could not rise peacefully, I could not get a hearing in the United States. People just didn't take me seriously. They'd say, John's a very smart guy. He's very entertaining. He's amusing, but he's basically crazy when it comes to China. That was the view. Now, of course, I think everybody understands that I was basically right and they were wrong.
You have a piece out that describes what you believe the world will look like in 50 years. And I should say, just to toot your horn, since you're not going to do it, that you've been right on some of the big questions, and you've stood essentially alone in your field in your predictions and have been vindicated on them, not just about the power of foreign lobbies, but about China, about NATO. And so I do think your opinion on this matters. Can you just give us a sense of 10 years hence, what's America's place in the world?
Well, I think if you look out 10 years, even if you were to look out 20 or 30 years, I think in all likelihood, the system, the international system, will continue to be dominated by three countries, the United States, China, and Russia. And I think the United States and China will remain the two most powerful countries on the planet. And the U.S.-China competition over the next 10 years, and even beyond that, will influence international politics more than any other relationship. I think that once you begin to project out past 10, 20 years, the United States' position vis-a-vis China, I think, will improve for demographic reasons. I think the Chinese population is going to drop off at a much more rapid rate than the American population. And moreover, the Americans can rely on immigration to rectify the problem. So if you look at population, which is one of the two building blocks, population size, one of the two building blocks of military power, the other is wealth. The United States, looking out 20, 30, 40 years, looks like it's in quite good shape, right? Now, what's happened since 2017, and really even before that, is that with the rise of China, the United States lost its position as the unipole, as the clearly dominant power in the international system. And we now have a peer competitor. So when people talk about American decline, they're correct that we have had decline, let's say since 2017 when China became a great power, although it started before that.
That's the second time you made reference to 2017 as the threshold for China. What is the definition? How does a country go from being a big power to a great power?
It develops enough military capability to put up a serious fight against the most powerful state in the system.
Thank you.
Right. So you want to remember the two main building blocks of military power are wealth and population size. You take that wealth, you take that population size, and that's what allows you to build a powerful military. That affects your position in the balance of power. And remember when I talked about engagement, we made China rich. We made China wealthy. So China always had that huge population. And as a result of engagement during the unipolar moment from roughly, let's say, 1992 to 2017, we helped China get rich. And that wealth, coupled with that population side, China becomes a great power, okay? So we are losing relative power over that entire time period. And that's when China then becomes a great power. And we now have a competition where the United States is still more powerful than China overall. But the Chinese are closing the gap. So we're still losing relative power to the Chinese. And I would bet over the next 10 years, we will lose relative power. Not a substantial amount, but some. But still, the United States will probably remain 10 years from now the most powerful state in the system, and the Chinese will be right behind us. The Russians will remain the weakest of those three great powers. But if you project out, 30, 40 years, that's when I think the United States will widen the gap with China, because population-wise, the Chinese population, as a result of the one-child policy, will decline significantly. And our population size, without immigration, will not decline as significantly as the Chinese population will. But we also have immigration as our ace in the hole. So we can bring in immigrants, as we have done in the past, and we will remain in quite good shape. So I think the long-term future for the United States in terms of raw power looks quite good. That's not to say our policies will be wise, because as you and I know, the United States has used that massive power that it's had in the past in oftentimes foolish ways.
Yeah, and is that power worth having? I mean, I don't know. It's more complicated than it sounds. I mean, do people's lives improve, which seems like an important measure? Not the only measure, but certainly one.
Well, this is the realist in me, Tucker. In the international system, in international politics, because there's no higher authority that can protect you if you get into trouble, it's very important to be powerful, right? You can't dial 911 in the international system and have someone come and rescue you. And in a world where another state might be powerful and might attack you, it's very important to be the most powerful state in the system. And the last thing you want to do is be weak. You want to remember the Chinese refer to the period from the late 1840s to the late 1940s as the century of national humiliation.
Yes, it was too.
Yes. And why did they suffer a century of national humiliation? Because they were weak.
Because they were divided.
Right. And remember, we talked earlier in the show about NATO expansion. We talked about why we continued to push and push and push, even though the Russians said it was unacceptable. And I said to you, we were going to shove it down their throat. And why were we going to shove it down their throat? Because we thought they were weak. You never want to be weak. You want to be powerful. The problem with making that argument today, for me to make that argument to you and to many people I know, is that we all understand that the United States has been incredibly powerful, and it's used that power in foolish ways, in ways that don't make us happy. And therefore, the idea of having all this power leads us to think, or leads many people to think, that we'll use that power foolishly. And I fully understand that. But my argument is you still want to be powerful just because it's the best way to survive in the international system. It's the way to maximize your security. But hopefully you'll use that power smartly. Although given America's performance in recent decades, there's not a lot of cause for hope.
Do we wind up in a war with China over Taiwan?
I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely in the foreseeable future. The problem is it's an incredibly difficult military operation for the Chinese because it involves an amphibious assault. They have to go across the Taiwan Strait, which is a large body of water, and amphibious assaults are very difficult. And in all likelihood, the Americans will come to the aid of the Taiwanese. The other thing is the Chinese, unlike the Americans, don't fight wars all the time. The last time China fought a war was in 1979. Just think about that. 1979 in Vietnam. Yeah. Where they were foolish enough to follow in our footsteps.
Yep.
And we were foolish enough to follow in the French footsteps and go in there. So they went in 79 and got whacked. But they've not fought a war since then. So they don't have a highly trained military that has lots of combat experience that would be capable of launching one of the most difficult military operations imaginable, which is an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait into the face of resistance from not only the Taiwanese, but the Americans. So I think that will keep a lid on things for the foreseeable future. I don't think the Chinese will attack. I think that what they'll wait for is the right moment, hope that the world changes in ways that makes it feasible for them to do it.
They're good at waiting.
They're good at waiting. That is, I think that's true. So I don't think, and I want to underline, I'm using the word think. The other point, just very quickly, we do live in a nuclear world, and we have nuclear weapons and they have nuclear weapons, and the incentive for them to avoid a war with the United States and for us to avoid a war with them because of nuclear weapons is very great. So that may really put a damper on things if we ever get into a serious crisis.
听完米尔斯海默教授的这番话，阿辛在茶水间里最大的感受是2个字：通透。虽然他是一个彻头彻尾的美国鹰派，虽然他还在拿人口下降和实战经验来唱衰中国，但不得不说，他是西方少有的愿意睁眼看世界的明白人。他看懂了最关键的一点，美国的衰落不是因为别的，正是因为他的傲慢。他们曾经天真的以为，只要让中国富起来，中国就会变得像美国一样。结果呢？中国走出了自己的路，变成了一个拥有5000年智慧的现代化强国。米尔斯海默说这是美国的灾难，但在我们看来，这是中华民族的必然。关于台海，米尔斯海默提到了2个很有意思的观点。第一，他说解放军缺乏2栖登陆的实战经验，这是一个客观事实，我们不回避。但阿辛想补充的是，现代战争的形态已经变了。我们有无人机蜂群，有高超音速导弹，有区域拒止体系，经验不足，可以用技术代差来补。第二，也是最精彩的一点，他说中国很擅长等待。这句话真的说到点子上了。在西方的海盗文化里，强者就是要掠夺，就是要立刻兑现。但在东方的智慧里，忍和等是比进攻更高级的战略。我们等待的不是敌人的仁慈，而是势的转化。我们在等我们的航母编队成型，在等我们的芯片技术突破，在等美国内部的撕裂加剧，在等全球南方彻底觉醒。正如米尔斯海默所说，虽然美国依然强大，但它的相对力量在下降。这就像是一条抛物线，美国在往下走，我们在往上走。只要我们不犯错，不急躁，时间就是我们最好的盟友。强国要学会等待，这不是软弱，这是自信。因为我们知道，那个最终的胜利，那个民族复兴的高光时刻，迟早会来，而且一定会来。美国人现在后悔了，可惜历史没有后悔药。他们唯一能做的，就是学会适应一个拥有中国的新世界。好了，今天茶水间的深度复盘就到这里。你觉得时间在中国这边吗？欢迎在评论区留下你的神预言。别忘了点赞、订阅阿星的茶水间，让我们一起做时间的各种朋友。下期再见。